Hi everyone, today we are going to learn how to do basic operations with integers. Now to start, it's important for us to go over two really important pieces of vocabulary, the first being operations. So operations are simply math actions. So some examples are addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And those are actually the four basic operations we're going to talk about today. Now the other important vocabulary word is integer. So an integer is simply a whole number, which means a non-fraction. Now integers can be positive or negative. So -5 is an integer, 27 is an integer. So it's non-fractions, whole numbers, positive or negative. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about one way you can add and subtract integers. Now I tried to break it down into 3 steps that should always work, but if you have a different way of adding or subtracting integers, that is totally fine. So step 1, I'm going to ask you to look at the numbers and I want you to determine the signs, meaning whether it's positive or negative. Determine the sign of each number. So step 2, there's 2 different cases here. Case 1 is if the signs are the same, meaning both numbers are negative or both numbers are positive. If the signs are the same, we're going to combine or add the values. Now, case 2 is if the signs are different, meaning one is positive and one is negative. If the signs are different, we're going to find the difference between the 2 values, which means we're going to subtract the values. Once we've completed step 2, the last step is just figuring out the sign of your final answer. The bigger value is always going to tell you the sign of your final answer. So if you're starting with more positives, your answer is going to be positive. If you're starting with more negatives, your answer will be negative. A helpful tip is sometimes it helps to rewrite the numbers in a slightly different way. So for example, that first one, 12 minus 14. For many people, it's really helpful to rewrite this as 12 plus negative 14. I want to remind you that subtracting is just adding a negative. When we write it in this way, it's really easy to see that 12 is positive and 14 is negative. Another thing to look out for is when we have 2 minus signs or negatives that are right next to each other. When we see this, we are always going to rewrite the 2 negatives as a single plus sign. Now, I don't want you to think of this 5 as a negative number. I actually want you to think of it as a positive because 2 negatives make a positive only when they are right next to each other. The last tip that sometimes will make the problem a little bit easier is that you can actually swap the order of the numbers. When you're adding or subtracting, the order doesn't matter. What does matter is that the sign sticks with the number. So for example, 5 is positive, 3 is negative. So if I flip the order, I can just write this as 5 minus 3, and the problem looks much easier. We all know how to do 5 minus 3. Now once again, this is something that might help some of you and it might not. So it's really up to you and what works best for you. All right, so let's try a few together. For this first one, 12 minus 25. The first thing I'm going to do is rewrite my expression as 12 plus negative 25. So I can see that 12 is positive and 25 is negative. That's step 1, determine the sign. Now step 2 tells us that if the signs are different, which they are, we're going to subtract the values. So I'm actually going to do 25 minus 12. I'm just looking at the values. I don't care about the sign right now. So 25 minus 12, 5 minus 2 is 3, 2 minus 1 is 1. So my value is going to be 13. Now I just have to figure out what is the sign of my final answer. So now I'm going to go back and see what did I have more of. So I definitely had more negatives to start, which means my final answer is also going to be negative. There you go. Let's look at the second example. Here, once again, I'm going to rewrite this as -7 plus -13. So here I see that I have a negative and another negative. So step 2 tells us if the signs are the same, we add up the values. We're going to combine them. So 13 plus 7 is 20. Now we have to figure out the sign of our final answer. So our bigger number is negative. In fact, both numbers are negative. So my final answer is going to be negative. All right, for this last one, 2 different ways we can do it. One, we can use our method. We can say, okay, this is a negative number. This is a positive number. And remember, when the signs are different, we subtract the values. So 14 minus 9 is 5. Our bigger number here was actually positive, so our answer is positive 5. Another thing you could do is you could actually swap the order from the beginning and then write it as 14 minus 9, which is exactly what we did right here. So either way, it's about the same amount of work, and we end up with the same solution of positive 5. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and please give these 3 a try. And when I ask you to pause the video, I really do expect you to pause it and try so you're getting that practice on your own. All right, go ahead and check your work here. So you can see for part A, we have different signs. So I subtracted the value, but my final answer is going to be negative, so negative 11. For part B, we have the same signs, so I added the values, and my final answer is also going to be negative. For part C, different signs means we subtract the values. We had more negatives, so our answer is negative. All right, let's try 2 more together. So here we have that case where we have those double negatives right next to each other. So whenever you see this, I want you to circle or highlight them, and we're always going to rewrite it as a single plus sign. So really, this is just 6 plus 12, which of course is 18, and it's as easy as that. Now for the part B, you have to be a little bit careful. Only these 2 signs are affected. This one is by itself, is not touching anything, so that 4 is going to keep the negative. But the 2 that I've highlighted are going to become a single plus. So subtracting a negative is just adding. So this 5 is actually a positive number. So let's finish solving this. Here we have a negative and a positive. When the signs are different, we subtract. Now I started with more positives, which means my answer is going to be positive 1. All right, go ahead and pause the video here, and please give this one a try. We'll check the answer in just a minute. Okay, go ahead and check. For part A, 15 minus negative 7 just means 15 plus 7, which is 22. For part B, this means negative 13 plus 6. Now here, I have a negative and a positive. Different signs subtract the values, so I get 7. But since I started with more negatives, my final answer is going to be negative 7. All right, now I want to switch gears and talk about the rules for multiplying and dividing with integers. So first of all, when you have parentheses that are touching like this, it means multiplication. So there's 4 basic rules. Well, actually only 3. When you're multiplying 2 positives, our answer is always going to be positive. If you're multiplying and only one of them is negative, so in this case or this case, if one of the numbers is negative, your answer will be negative. It does not matter which value is larger. So let me repeat. When you're multiplying, if one of the values is negative, your answer will be negative. However, when you're multiplying or dividing, if both are negative, your answer will become positive. So let's try a few of these together. For part A, I see that I have a single negative. My answer will be negative, and then 8 times 6 is 48. For part B, I have 2 positives, so my answer will just be positive 35. And for part C, when I have a negative times a negative, they actually cancel out, and I end up with positive 27. Go ahead and pause the video and give these 3 a try. So go ahead and check your work. Part A, you should have negative 24 because only 1 is negative. Part B, you should have negative 56 because only 1 is negative. Remember, it doesn't matter which value is larger. As long as 1 is negative, your answer will be negative. However, for part C, when you multiply 2 negatives, they become a positive. Here's a little challenge problem for you. I'm wondering if you can figure out what would the sign be if you have a negative times a negative times a negative. And then what if you're multiplying 4 negatives, and what if you're multiplying 5 negatives? See if you can figure out a general rule. See if you can then generalize a rule for multiplying and dividing with negatives. I'll give you a second to think about that. So for part A, when I'm multiplying 3 negatives, those first 2 will actually cancel each other out. This negative times this negative will become a positive. However, I still have a negative left over, so my sign is going to be negative. But let's look at part B. These 2 negatives cancel each other out. These 2 cancel out, so I have a positive. Let's look at part C. These cancel out, and I have a negative. So you might notice that it's flip-flopping from negative to positive to negative. So perhaps if you wanted to generalize a rule, it would be odd amounts of negatives make a negative answer. So for example, in this first part, I had 3 negatives and it was negative. I had 5 negatives and it's negative. And even amounts of negatives, make a positive answer because pairs cancel each other out. So remember, this was just a challenge problem, and I did ask you to generalize a rule. So a little bit trickier, but if you can remember that rule, it might help you out down the road. All right, thank you so much for watching. I will see you tomorrow in class.